You know how some people say they always felt different? Like there was this nagging voice in the back of their head telling them something wasn't quite right? Well, I wasn't one of those people. I was 32 years old, living what I thought was a perfectly ordinary life with a perfectly ordinary family history. My name is Sarah, and up until 6 months ago, I would have sworn on my grandmother's grave that I knew exactly who I was and where I came from. My childhood was like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting, or at least that's how I remembered it. Dad would come home from his job at the insurance company every evening at exactly 5:47 p.m. I know because I used to time it, sitting by the front window waiting for his burgundy sedan to pull into our driveway. Mom would have dinner ready, usually something comforting like pot roast or her famous chicken casserole that made the whole house smell like home. We'd sit around our oak dining table, and Dad would ask about my day at school while Mom fussed over whether I was eating enough vegetables. "Sarah's got her father's stubborn streak," Mom would say with this fond smile, ruffling my hair as she cleared the dishes. Dad would chuckle and nod, pointing out how I inherited his determination. The same trait that helped him work his way up from filing clerk to district manager. I felt proud of that connection, you know? Like I was carrying on some family legacy of persistence and hard work. But looking back now, with the bitter clarity that only comes after your world's been turned upside down, I can see the cracks that were always there. Little things that my trusting, naive mind just explained away. Like how I was the only one in our family with curly auburn hair, while both my parents had straight, mousy brown locks. "You got your grandmother's hair," Mom would say whenever anyone commented on it. "She had the most beautiful curls." Except, I'd seen pictures of Grandma Rose, and her hair was as straight as a board. Or how about the way Dad's face would go blank whenever anyone mentioned how different I looked from him? Not angry, not uncomfortable, just empty. Like he was somewhere else entirely. I thought maybe he was just modest, didn't like being the center of attention. Gott, I was so stupid. So willing to believe the story they'd been telling me my entire life. The real kicker? I actually defended them when other people pointed out the obvious. My college roommate Jessica used to joke that I must be adopted because I looked nothing like either parent. Very funny, I roll my eyes. I'm just a genetic throwback. I had an answer for everything, didn't I? Every inconsistency, every odd comment from relatives, every awkward pause when family history came up. I was their biggest advocate, their most loyal defender. The irony is that I might have gone my whole life living in that bubble of comfortable lies if it wasn't for my stupid, wonderful curiosity about family trees. Last December, my cousin Emma got one of those DNA testing kits for Christmas. She was going on and on about how fascinating it was to discover she had Scandinavian ancestry, how the percentages lined up perfectly with what our family had always known about our heritage. "You should totally do one, Sarah," she said during our post-holiday lunch. "I bet you'd find some interesting surprises in your background." She meant it as casual conversation, the kind of thing you say when you're making small talk. But something about the way she said surprises stuck with me. There was this tiny pause, this split second where her eyes darted away from mine. I should have paid attention to that pause. I should have asked her what she meant. Instead, I just smiled and said, "Maybe I will." Because, honestly, the idea intrigued me. I'd always been drawn to genealogy, spent hours as a kid flipping through Mom's old photo albums, asking about great-aunts and second cousins. I thought it would be fun to see our family's migration patterns mapped out in scientific detail. What a joke that turned out to be. I ordered the kit the next week during my lunch break, sitting in my car outside the office building where I work as a marketing coordinator. It felt so innocent, so harmless. Just spit in a tube, mail it off, wait for results. The website promised I'd learn about my ethnic background, maybe connect with distant relatives I'd never known existed. It sounded like the perfect way to surprise my parents with some interesting family trivia. The waiting was actually kind of exciting at first. I'd check my email every morning, hoping for that notification that my results were ready. I started imagining all the cool discoveries I might make. Maybe we had Irish roots that explained my love of folk music, or perhaps there was some exotic Mediterranean ancestry that accounted for my olive complexion. But as the weeks dragged on, something strange started happening. I began noticing things about my parents' behavior that I'd somehow missed before. Like how Mom would change the subject whenever I mentioned the DNA test. Not obviously, she was too subtle for that. But she'd suddenly remember something urgent she needed to do in the kitchen, or she'd start talking about work drama, anything to steer the conversation away from genetics and family history. And Dad? Dad got quiet. Quieter than usual, I mean. He'd always been the strong, silent type, but there was a new tension in his silence. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at me with this expression I couldn't quite read. Sadness? Fear? Regret? I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just being overly sensitive because I was excited about the test results. But deep down, in that place where your gut knows things before your brain catches up, I started to feel uneasy. Like I was standing on the edge of a cliff I couldn't see, waiting for someone to push me over. The email finally came on a Tuesday morning in February. I was rushing to get ready for work, running late because I'd hit the snooze button one too many times, when I heard the familiar ping of my phone. Your ancestry DNA results are ready. The subject line announced cheerfully. My heart actually fluttered with excitement. Finally, I thought. Finally, I'd get to solve the mystery of my family's genetic puzzle. I almost waited until I got to the office to look at them. Almost. But curiosity won out, as it always does with me. I sat down on the edge of my unmade bed, still in my pajamas, and clicked the link with trembling fingers. The first page loaded, showing my ethnic breakdown in a colorful pie chart. Irish, German, English, exactly what I'd expected based on our family stories. Noting shocking Tiere. I scrolled down to see the relative matches, expecting to find Emma's name and maybe some distant cousins I could reach out to for family stories. That's when my world tilted sideways. There, at the top of my closest DNA matches, was a name I didn't recognize, Michael Patterson. The relationship estimate said, close family, likely half-brother. I stared at those words until they burned themselves into my retinas. Half-brother. Half-brother. Two words that made absolutely no sense in the context of my life as I knew it. I must have sat there for 10 minutes, just staring at my phone screen, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something logical. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe the lab had mixed up samples. Maybe half-brother didn't mean what I thought it meant. But as I clicked through to Michael's profile, seeing that he was 35 years old and lived just 2 states away, the impossible truth began to sink in. I had a brother. A half-brother I'd never heard of, never been told about, never even suspected existed. Which could only mean one thing: everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie. I called in sick to work that day. There was no way I could sit in meetings and pretend to care about quarterly marketing reports when my entire identity was crumbling around me. Instead, I spent the morning pacing around my apartment like a caged animal, clutching my phone and staring at Michael Patterson's profile picture. He looked like me. God, he looked so much like me it was unsettling.
Same Auburn Kohls, same green eyes, sames Lichtli kruckt smile.
We could have been twins separated by 3 years instead of half-siblings who'd never met. How was it possible that this person existed, that half of my DNA was walking around in some stranger's body, and I'd never known? The logical part of my brain kept trying to find innocent explanations. Maybe Dad had been married before and never mentioned it. Maybe Michael was from a relationship that ended badly, and bringing him up was too painful. There had to be some reasonable story that would make sense of this discovery without destroying everything I believed about my parents. But the more I studied Michael's information, the more those hopeful theories fell apart. Born in 1988, just 3 years before me. If Dad had another child that close to my birth year, wouldn't I have known? Wouldn't there have been child support payments, custody arrangements, something? Unless the timeline meant something else entirely. Something that made my stomach churn with a possibility I didn't want to consider. I must have started and deleted 50 different messages to Michael that morning. Hi, I think we might be related. Delete. This might sound crazy, but delete. I just got my DNA results and delete. How do you reach out to a complete stranger who might hold the key to your family's biggest secret? What do you even say? Finally, around noon, I managed to send something simple. Hi Michael, I'm Sarah. According to Ancestry DNA, we're half-siblings.
I had no idea you existed until today.
Would you be willing to talk? I hit send before I could change my mind, then immediately regretted it. What if he thought I was some kind of scammer? What if he didn't want anything to do with surprise family members? What if he knew about me all along, and I was the only one who'd been kept in the dark? But Michael wrote back within an hour, and his message changed everything. Sarah, I've been wondering about you my whole life. I knew I had a half-sister, but Mom never told me your name or how to find you. I'm so glad you reached out. Can we talk on the phone? I've been wondering about you my whole life. He'd known about me. Someone, somewhere, had told him he had a sister, while I'd grown up thinking I was an only child.
The betrayal hit me like a physical blow, making it hard to breathe.
We talked for 3 hours that afternoon. Michael's voice was warm and familiar in a way that made no sense. How could a stranger's voice feel like coming home? He told me about growing up with his mother, Janet, in Ohio. How she'd always been vague about his father, saying only that he was a good man who couldn't be part of our lives. How he'd tried to search for his paternal family as an adult but had never had enough information to make progress. I always wondered if I had siblings, he said, and I could hear the emotion in his voice. Mom used to get this sad look when I asked about my dad's family. Like she was keeping something from me to protect me. Protect you from what? I asked, though I was starting to have my own terrible suspicions. I think. Michael paused, and I heard him take a shaky breath. I think maybe my father was married when I was conceived. I think maybe that's why Mom never wanted to talk about it. The words hung between us like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet. Married when Michael was conceived.
Born in 1988.
3 years before me, during what I'd always assumed was the happiest period of my parents' marriage.
Michael, I whisperet, what was your mother's maidenname? Pettersen.
Why? And she never married your father?
No.
She said he wasn't available.
Another pause.
Sarah, what's your father's name? I closed my eyes, already knowing what I was about to confirm.
Robert. Robert Mitchell.
The silence stretched between us for what felt like an eternity. When Michael finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. That's him. That's my father's name. Everything clicked into place with horrible clarity. My father, my devoted, reliable, steady father, had cheated on my mother. Had another child. Had been living a double life for over 30 years, and I'd been too blind to see it. I hung up the phone and immediately threw up. When I could finally function again, I knew I had to confront them. But I couldn't just march over there and start screaming accusations. I needed to be strategic, needed to give them a chance to explain before I completely lost my mind. I drove to my parents' house that evening, clutching printouts of Michael's DNA profile like evidence in a criminal case. They were in the living room watching the news when I walked in, looking so normal and innocent that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Honey. Mom jumped up to hug me.
What a nice surprise. Have you eaten? Ivy got leftover soupy kultit up.
Actually, I wanted to talk to you both about something. I sat down across from them, trying to keep my voice steady. I got my DNA test results back today. The change in the room was immediate. Dad's face went pale, and Mom's smile froze in place. They looked at each other with an expression I'd never seen before. A communication that seemed to happen without words. Oh. Mom's voice was too bright, too casual. Find any interesting ancestors? I pulled out the printouts and set them on the coffee table between us.
I found a half-brother.
His name is Michael Patterson, and according to the DNA analysis, we share the same father. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom's hand flew to her throat, and Dad seemed to shrink into himself, suddenly looking every one of his 62 years. Sarah, Dad finally said, his voice barely a whisper, I can explain. Can you? I stood up, anger and hurt flooding through me like poison. Can you explain how I have a brother I never knew existed? Can you explain how his mother knew your name, knew you had another child, while I grew up thinking I was an only child? Can you explain 33 years of lies? Mom started crying then, quiet tears that rolled down her cheeks without her seeming to notice them. "We wanted to tell you," she said. "So many times, we almost told you. But you didn't." My voice was getting louder, but I couldn't seem to control it. "You let me live my entire life believing in a fairy tale. Do you have any idea what it feels like to discover that everything you thought you knew about your family is a lie?" Dad tried to reach for me, but I stepped back.
Sarah, please.
"Let us explain what happened."
It's not what you think.
"It's exactly what I think." I was shouting now, all pretense of calm gone. "You cheated on Mom. You had another child. You abandoned him and then lied to me about it for 33 years. What else is there to understand?" "I didn't abandon him," Dad said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made me stop yelling. "I sent money every month. I wanted to be part of his life, but Janet, his mother, she didn't want me to complicate things. She thought it would be better for everyone if I stayed away."
Better for Everione.
I couldn't believe what I was hearing. What about what was better for me? What about my right to know I had a brother? Mom wiped her eyes and looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, raw, desperate honesty. "We were scared, Sarah. We made a mistake, a terrible mistake, and we were terrified that if you knew the truth, you'd hate us. That we'd lose you." "Well, congratulations," I said, grabbing my purse and heading for the door. Mission accomplished. I left them sitting there in their living room, surrounded by 33 years of carefully constructed lies, and drove home through tears that made it hard to see the road. I didn't speak to my parents for 2 weeks. I know that probably sounds petty, but I needed time to process what I'd learned without their voices in my head, trying to justify or explain away the betrayal. Instead, I talked to Michael every day, slowly piecing together the story of our shared father and the family I'd never known I had. Michael was incredibly patient with my anger and confusion. He'd had his whole life to wonder about our father, to imagine what kind of man would create a child and then disappear from his life. But he wasn't bitter the way I expected him to be. If anything, he seemed relieved to finally have answers, even painful ones. "I used to make up stories about him," Michael told me during one of our long phone conversations. "I'd pretend he was a spy, or a soldier overseas, or someone who'd lost his memory in an accident. Anything was better than thinking he just didn't want me." "But he did want you," I said, remembering Dad's quiet insistence that he hadn't abandoned Michael. "He said he sent money, that he wanted to be involved." "He did send money," Michael confirmed. "Every month until I turned 18. But money isn't the same as being there, you know? Money doesn't teach you how to throw a baseball or help with homework or show up at school plays." I thought about all the times Dad had done those things for me. Every soccer game he'd attended, every school project he'd helped with, every bedtime story he'd read. While I was getting the full father experience, Michael was growing up with checks in the mail and questions that never got answered. "I'm sorry," I said, though I wasn't sure exactly what I was apologizing for. "I'm sorry you grew up without him. I'm sorry I got what should have been shared between us." "Don't apologize for having a father," Michael said gently. "I'm glad one of us got to know him. Maybe you can tell me what he's really like." That conversation broke something open in me. Here was this man, this brother I'd never known existed, asking me to share stories about our father like they were precious gifts. He didn't resent me for having what he'd missed. He just wanted to understand the person who'd shaped both our lives in such different ways. So I told him about Dad's terrible jokes and his obsession with old westerns. About how he'd make pancakes shaped like animals on Saturday mornings and always let me help change the oil in his car, even when I was too small to actually be useful. About his quiet strength and the way he'd listen to my problems without trying to fix everything right away. "He sounds like a good man," Michael said when I finished. "Complicated but good." "He is," I admitted, and realized I still believed it despite everything. That's what makes this so hard to understand. The father I know isn't the kind of person who would cheat and lie and keep secrets. But apparently, he is that person, and I just never saw it. It was Michael who finally convinced me to reach out to our parents. "You don't have to forgive them," he said. "But maybe you need to hear their side of the story. All of it, Not just the parts they were willing to tell you when you were angry. He was right, of course. I'd been so focused on my own hurt and betrayal that I hadn't really listened to what they'd tried to explain that terrible night. I'd heard affair and lies, and shut down everything else. I called Mom on a Wednesday evening, 2 weeks and 3 days after I'd stormed out of their house. She answered on the first ring, like she'd been waiting by the phone.
Sarah.
Her voice was hopeful and terrified at the same time. I want to hear the whole story, I said without preamble.
Everything. From the beginning.
And I want Dad there too. They came over to my apartment the next evening, looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen them. Mom carried a manila envelope that she set on my kitchen table like it contained something dangerous. We brought pictures, she said quietly, of Michael when he was little. Janet, his mother. She used to send them with updates about how he was doing in school, what sports he was playing. We have every one. The revelation that they'd known about Michael's childhood, had been getting regular updates and photos, hit me like another betrayal. But I pushed the anger down and waited for them to talk. Dad cleared his throat and began the hardest conversation of our family's life. It was 1987, he said. Your mother and I were going through a rough patch. We'd been trying to have a baby for 3 years, and the doctors kept saying there was no medical reason why it wasn't happening. We were both stressed, fighting more than usual, not really connecting the way we should have been. Mom took over the story. I suggested we take a break from trying to conceive, maybe focus on fixing our marriage first. Your father agreed, but I think we both felt like failures. Like we were broken somehow. I started working late more often, Dad continued. Partly because I was genuinely busy at work, but partly because I didn't want to come home to the tension and disappointment.
Tats wen I met Janet.
She was a secretary at one of our client companies. We started talking during business meetings, and she was. He paused, struggling with the words. She was easy to talk to. Comfortable. She didn't make me feel like I was disappointing her just by existing. It wasn't an excuse, Mom said quickly, seeing my expression. We're not trying to excuse what happened. But we want you to understand the context. Dad nodded. It only happened a few times. I was never going to leave your mother. I want you to understand that. I loved her then, and I love her now. But I was weak and selfish, and I made choices that hurt everyone involved. When Janet told me she was pregnant, he continued, I was terrified. Terrified of losing your mother, terrified of destroying our marriage, terrified of what it would mean for this child I'd helped create. Janet was incredible about it, though. She said she didn't want to break up a marriage, didn't want to force me to choose between families. She just wanted me to help support the baby financially. So you did, I said. It wasn't a question. Every month for 18 years, Dad confirmed. And Janet sent pictures and updates so we could watch him grow up. She never asked for more than financial support, never threatened to tell you or anyone else. She just handled it with more grace than I deserved. Mom opened the manila envelope and spread photographs across my table. Michael as a toddler with chocolate cake smeared across his face.
Michael in a Little League uniform, missing 2 front teeth.
Michael at what looked like a high school graduation, wearing a cap and gown and that crooked smile I recognized from looking in mirrors. We wanted to tell you so many times, Mom said, her voice breaking. When you were old enough to understand, when you started asking about siblings, when you went away to college. But the longer we waited, the harder it became. How do you explain to your child that they have a brother you've been hiding from them their entire life? I picked up one of the photos, Michael at maybe 8 years old, standing next to a woman with kind eyes and graying hair.
Janet, I assumet.
His mother, who'd made the impossible decision to raise her son alone rather than destroy another family.
Have you ever met him?
I asked.
In person, I mean.
Dad shook his head. Janet thought it would be too confusing for Michael, having me show up occasionally but not being a real father to him. She said it was better to make a clean break, let him have the life she could give him without complicating it with the life I couldn't. But you wanted to? The question came out smaller than I'd intended.
Everde, det whisperet.
Every single day for 35 years, I've wondered what kind of man my son was becoming. Whether he was happy, whether he needed anything, whether he hated me for not being there. He doesn't hate you, I said, surprising myself with the words. He wants to meet you. Both of you. He has questions, and he's not angry the way I was. He wants to understand where he came from. The conversation that followed was long and painful and necessary. We talked about the years of secrecy, about the choice to have me even after Michael was born, about the constant fear that their past would destroy their future. We talked about the money Dad had sent, about the photos Mom had hidden in a shoebox in their bedroom closet, about the nights they'd lain awake wondering if they were doing the right thing. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. I wasn't ready for that yet. But it was understanding, which felt like a start. I want to arrange a meeting, I said finally. Michael wants to meet you, and I think maybe it's time. Mom started crying again, but these were different tears. Relief mixed with hope, mixed with 35 years of suppressed grief for the son she'd never been allowed to know. The meeting happened 2 weeks later, at a restaurant halfway between our cities. I got there early and sat in my car, watching for two men who shared my DNA but felt like strangers. When I saw them walking toward each other in the parking lot, Michael with his confident stride and Dad with his nervous shuffle, I almost chickened out. But then they were embracing, this father and son who'd been separated by secrets and circumstances, and I realized I was witnessing something extraordinary. Not just a reunion, but a healing. Not just an ending, but a beginning. Michael fit into our family like he'd always been there. Not perfectly, there was still awkwardness, still conversations that had to be navigated carefully, still the reality that you can't undo 35 years of separation overnight. But there was love too. Immediate and powerful and surprising in its intensity.